Hello, my name is Elizaveta Dorrer, and I present as a mission number 2186, which is a research done by me and my supervisor, Masaru Yarime, and we both work at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So our ongoing research is titled Normalization of Facial Recognition Technologies, Interplay of Top-Down Enforcement by the Government and Internalization by the Public. Case study of Moscow Metro. In the aftermath of somewhat ongoing COVID pandemics, we see accelerated rise of the smart cities. One of the technologies that is used in the context of smart cities is facial recognition. And during pandemics, it was used to limit the spread of the disease, to detect violators of mask regimes and violators of quarantine prescriptions. And as a consequence of that, we can see increasing policing capacities of the state. As an aftermath of this successful application of facial recognition, we see the correspondent interest in video surveillance systems with application of facial recognition technologies in the large urbanizations around the world. And all of this is being unraveled on the background of still unresolved ethical concerns and the lack of regulatory framework. We still have to address the question of how we should regulate facial recognition surveillance and meet data privacy concerns raised by the public. At the same time, while all of these concerns and issues are not resolved, we witness how AI-powered surveillance has been normalized, as captured by the report done by Ada Lovelace Institute recently. So a part of addressing the challenges posed by technology itself, we also have to focus on the ways how the relationships between technology and population evolve. And we have to understand, track, and potentially intervene in these dynamics. Because while we're addressing the ethical issues, there is another process of normalization on the background, and it affects how the population responds to the ethical issues. So let me briefly go through the important concepts and ideas behind this research, also to further ground what we're tackling here. Let me go through the idea of privacy. As of today, idea of privacy has gone a long way from rarely used concept to an unquestionable human right. For the first time, the concept of privacy became a subject of debate after the introduction of the first affordable cameras and accelerating influence of printed media. As a response to this, iconic article titled "The Right to Privacy" was published in 1890 by Warren and Brandeis, and they were first to bring this issue of privacy to the public attention. And only a century later, we have seen formulated notion and idea of personal data privacy, only a century after it was clarified and introduced in legal terms in a document that we commonly refer to as GDPR. So the second concept that I want to go through is surveillance and its connection to safety and security. So first, let's distinguish security and safety. And as Marcuse puts it, security is the perceived protection from danger, while safety is an actual protection from danger. Surveillance, that kind of the issue of surveillance that rises from this two competing sometimes terms around surveillance as an idea, as notion, there are several important theoretizations around this topic. So first, surveillance theater tells about security measures that are aimed rather decreasing the fear of crime than actually combating the actual crime. So we see this distinction between security and real safety. Another idea is stage set security. This connects the surveillance more to the urban context. This term means intention to advertise the city's security to become more compelling stage for sports mega events. Concept close to the previous two is technology theater, which describes public debate that is concerned rather with technological aspects of policy initiative than with the underlying policy issues and critical questions of power and equality. So we see how these evolving practices of surveillance are actually disconnected from the actual safety, and they rather refer more to our sense of security, and it kind of deepens the discussion about why we need all these surveillance systems and what are the consequences and what is our relationship to this. Because actually, when we talk about surveillance, we're not necessarily improving the actual safety. So surveillance as a means to exercise state control over the physical bodies of the citizens is a central argument of the biopolitics discourse started by Foucault. He also brought up an image of panopticon in his publication titled Discipline and Punish. You can see this picture on the left. And after Foucault brought this notion and metaphor to the discourse around surveillance, many scholars were discussing it. And right now, recently, in the context of smart cities, many scholars in surveillance studies come to an agreement that this metaphor of panopticon is no longer fitting new reality. However, there's another camp of researchers who argue that this is still a viable metaphor, mostly because it describes a setting where constant monitoring ultimately leads to self-discipline and self-restraint. And that's exactly the case we can observe with proliferation of cameras, and especially now with facial recognition technology. Normalization is commonly used in relation to technology in both academia and media and in the corporate world. You can see here on the left just a couple of titles of the news. And I'm sure that you've heard a lot of this news and mentions of the new normal, normalization, and so on. And however, so there are a lot of mentions of this term, but however, there's no shared conceptual framework that would allow us to place this concept in the context of policy processes. Going back to Foucault, disciplinary power and biopower are revealed through establishing what is normal and desirable, and punishing the deviance. So this is kind of state level understanding of norm from the view of the governments, of the people in power. The norm is a way to control individual bodies or populations, depending on what kind of power in Foucault's term we're talking about. And if we look at the term norm and normalization from the point of view of individual, we can refer to Hacking, who did a bit of kind of background research on the meaning of the word normal. He knows that the meaning close to usual, regular, common, typical that we now use when we say normal. This meaning appeared in early 19th century in connection to biological and medical research. He explains that normal originated hand in hand with pathological. And now, apart from describing what is typical and statistically average, this notion of normal grew to heavily hint also at what is right and wrong. And so to further explore this personal level of normalization, we can look at research done in the field of psychology. There are a couple important papers in this regard. Firstly, Beer and Nobe, they distinct three types of normal and norms. So the first is descriptive, then prescriptive, and undifferentiated. So what we call just normal is actually undifferentiated norm. According to the authors, it kind of combines together two dimensions, which is our perception of statistical norm, so descriptive norm, like how often we think something happens. And another level is prescriptive, so that's a normative judgment that we attach to this event or behavior. And following these authors, another author explores this dual and single nature hypothesis of the norm. Dual nature hypothesis means that our undifferentiated norm, how we just judge something as being normal or not normal, is consists of these two perceptions of how often this thing happens and how good or bad is it. And the single nature hypothesis means that only one aspect matters. So for some people, only statistical dimension is important, or only normative judgment is important to kind of say whether something is normal or not. These authors, they ran several experiments, which we kind of use as a starting point for our research methodology. And they did several experiments to determine whether two dimensions kind of form our understanding of normal or only one. They come to a conclusion that it depends on the object and circumstances, but in the most of the cases, both dimensions matter. Summarizing the previous section, we can see that interpretation of the norm and normal proposed by Foucault suggests only one direction of influence, so the control exercised by the state on the population through the norm and normalization. Then behavioral psychology, of course, doesn't include the dimension of the state due to the specifics of the field and work with the kind of individual level mechanics of normalization. But the public policy includes both dimensions. And we propose to approach operationalization of normalization from these two directions, kind of unite them in one framework, describing the mechanisms by which the individuals normalize technology, and then explore the top-down direction and the ways in which the governments promote or halt normalization and how they utilize subsequent effects. And so in the middle of that would be technology and then two-way dynamics around that. We propose a draft framework for how this would work. As I said, the kind of state is one body here, kind of on top of the structure, then the population and technology in between, and we see this dynamic processes. So when the state affects the ways technology is deployed, the way it's promoted, and then it kind of results in normalization, and through this it exercises control over the population, but also there is a bottom-up processes which are not always related to the actions of the government. And so there is this kind of complicated socio-technical system that we see here. We probably can define also these subsystems of normalized technology and instrumentalized normalization, depending on kind of what actors we include in these subsystems. I would be curious to hear your thinking and suggestions about that. So based on all of these introduced concepts, ideas, and frameworks, we set objectives of our research as firstly, establishing the relationship between statistical and normative dimensions of facial recognition normalization by the public. And secondly, suggest the ways how the interplay of top-down enforcement by the government and internalization by the public affect normalization of facial recognition technologies. Our main research questions are, firstly, how is normality judgment formed in the case of facial recognition technologies? We want to define the roles of statistical and normative judgment in the case of FRT. The second question is, in the case of facial recognition technologies, does the change of the perception of statistical norm lead to the change in the normative judgment? And this is a very important question. It can be exemplified through how children perceive what is good behavior from how frequently they observe some behavior. So according to psychologists in children, this is how it works. If they see something occurring frequently, then they think it's good to do this kind of thing. It doesn't work for like that in all of the cases with adults, but it's curious to explore this more in depth in relation to emerging technologies and facial recognition. And our third question is, if facial recognition technologies get normalized for one application in some public spaces, for example, in transportation and payments, does it affect its normalization for another application, such as for policing and law enforcement? We propose to study these questions on a case study in Moscow. It's important to say that currently Moscow has like very extensive surveillance camera system, which includes more than 200,000 cameras. All the data is collected in one data collection center. And last year, additional cameras supporting facial recognition technologies were deployed to the turnstiles at all of the Moscow subway stations, which is 241 stations, within the scope of this new project called FacePay. And it is presented as serving purely for the comfort Moscow metro passengers. So it's introduced as a comfortable cutting-edge technology service that is safe in terms of personal data privacy. It is true, kind of, because actually we can call this project one camera two systems, because all of those cameras can be accessed by Moscow law enforcement services. And so the police can access every single camera and run their own FRT algorithms for identifying individuals. And the recent reports by independent organization over the info reveals that there is solid evidence that indeed this facial recognition technologies is used by the police to target those people who protest, including anti-war protests. And they, in many cases, are detained several days or even weeks after the protests because the footage being processed and then used against them. And let me briefly introduce our methodology. Our plan is to conduct a series of interviews in Moscow as a treatment group and in St. Petersburg as a control group, because the scale of the surveillance system is comparable, and it's the second largest in Russia, but there is no such service as FacePay. So if we want to see whether normalization of casually used facial recognition technologies leads to normalization of FRT used for policing, if we want to explore this question, then it would be useful to compare to similar cities in this regard. And the survey's focus will be on perception of facial recognition technology in public spaces as normal. So we want to check if it's perceived as normal and what kind of dimensions of this normality is important for people. Statistical norm, normative norm, or undifferentiated, and how the actual norm is combined, or maybe it consists only of one dimension. And the same we want to do for FRT used for law enforcement. Additionally, we will do an experiment and manipulate the statistical perception. So we want to see if manipulation of statistical perception can lead to a change of the perception of what is normal, to see what kind of policy tools, in a good way and in a bad way, can be used to influence the processes of normalization and perception of something being normal. As I mentioned, this is ongoing research, so the next step for us is to finalize the survey and the experiment design, recruit the participants, and potentially make additional surveys in other countries such as Hong Kong to test this approach in different geographies and contexts. And as for policy implications, we are pointing out to the fact that while the fears that facial recognition technology would become normalized and discussions around shifting all kinds of norms proliferate, there is urgency to provide safeguards against undesirable normalization and to develop a comprehensive conceptual framework of normalization that would guide policy research and design. As I mentioned, these two dimensions of the state level of normalization and individuals level, in regard of the former, Foucault's take on the way the governments instrumentalize the norm is rather dark. The state controls the population through normalization, through the norm. However, if we operationalize the norm, if we will be measuring normalization rates and understanding its mechanisms, we may establish a new way of monitoring the current state of technology perception by the public, and hence address public concerns and help in designing policies that intervene in this process. Moreover, if more insights into normalization of emerging technologies are gained, it could help in designing policies for promoting normalization of the favorable technology applications, such as renewable energy and some other technologies that actually improve the quality of our life. Lastly, an important question to be answered when studying mechanisms of surveillance normalization for public policy is the behavior that is consequential to adopting the new norm. So if we study attitudes, it can hint at the chance of resistance to unwanted policies or the chance of supporting the favorable policies, but we don't actually know what kind of behavior coincides if some technology is normalized by the public. So we think these questions would be important to address our research, and we hope that it will attract more attention to this question from the other researchers. And on this, I want to thank you for watching this video. Hope to see you at the actual presentation in December. Thank you.